Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Tips and Techniques on Using COBIT for Adopting GDPR, which is the forthcoming General Data Protection Regulations being enacted by the EU. My name is Ron Fagan, and I am the Partner Relations Manager for APMG. With me today is Mr. Mark Thomas from Scoot Consulting, and a bit more on Mark shortly. A couple of housekeeping items before we begin. This webinar is being recorded, and you will be receiving a link to both the recording as well as the slides probably before the end of the week. You should also see a question box in the GoToMeeting panel on your screen. If you have a question and you'd like Mark to respond to it, please enter it in that question box, and hopefully we will have time at the end of Mark's presentation to take a few questions. And lastly, we are always interested in your feedback. If there are any comments or suggestions you would like to pass our way, please send them to Mark Constable, whose address is below. So with that, let's begin. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Mark Thomas. You can read a bit about Mark on the screen, but just to summarize a bit, Mark's background includes being a project and program manager, a CIO, and a consultant with Accenture, as well as now a consultant on his own with Scoot. And you can be sure then that when Mark speaks, he is bringing not only his knowledge as a consultant, but also as a practitioner who has been held accountable by boards of directors, and that includes for his success in implementing frameworks. I have known Mark for a good number of years now, and I can add to this by saying that Mark has a unique ability to combine different disciplines, whether it is IT governance, IT service management, or program and project management, into a coherent view. And for those of us who may suffer from framework fatigue, this ability to integrate frameworks is what sets Mark apart. So with that, let me turn it over to today's speaker, Mark Thomas.
Great, thank you, Ron. I appreciate it, and thanks everyone for joining today. So just very quickly, let's hit some presentation goals before we jump into the meat of this stuff. So one of the things I want to do is really first just talk about some key elements of the GDPR. Now, you're not going to walk out of here as an expert in GDPR or an expert in COBIT, but what I want you to really do is think through this and how you recognize the value of really integrating not just COBIT, but other industry available frameworks to help you set up a good governance of enterprise IT platform, because that is the foundation to how you become compliant, not just to GDPR, but to any other type of regulation, compliance concern that you might have out in the industry. So I'm going to talk you through a couple of COBIT components and make some links for you so that you can go out and do some more research and maybe find some more good nuggets in COBIT that might help you out. And of course, we'll follow up with some good tips, some of my tips from having been in the compliance space for quite some time. So if everybody's okay with that, we'll move on to the next slide here. All right, so here's the agenda. We'll talk a little bit about GDPR. Of course, it wouldn't be a great compliance discussion without governance of enterprise IT. I'll make that link for you between the COBIT framework and, of course, jump right into my tips and hit some questions towards the end. So this thing is big. Oh, I think I jumped ahead. There we go. So the deadline is coming fast, and a lot of multinational companies they're still behind in preparing for this GDPR compliance. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about how that affects everybody. But this data protection reform, this replaces the Data Protection Directive. It is a sweeping regulations, and it requires organizations to meet what I consider some very, very stringent requirements regarding data protection over the personal use of the data of EU citizens. So for the first time, this also impacts companies outside of Europe. So compliance will cause some concern, of course, with, say, security or privacy teams, notably what constitutes PII, or personal identifiable or identification information. So this can range from basic identity information to address, including internet address, health, biometric, political, anything that could associate that with an individual. And therefore, this has become very, very, very big. All right, so let's talk a little bit about why this whole GDPR thing is different. Now, if you look at the GDPR, so the requirements to protect personal identification, this is not new. but this has been significantly growing with the explosion of, say, the cloud, with many other high-profile breaches. And to date, we've seen a lot of different directives. We've seen EU privacy directives, we've seen HIPAA, Safe Harbor, GLBA, Patriot Act in the US, many more of these are out there. But the GDPR appears to be much more aggressive, and it has tougher consequences for violations. So it leaves much room for interpretation, hence what they call reasonable. And so in the definition of protection regarding personal data, but it doesn't really constitute what that actually means. So this offers the GDPR, the governing body, a very wide avenue when it comes to things like assessing fines for noncompliance and those types of things. So what are some key parts or some key elements of this GDPR? So let's jump ahead and take a look at this. The elements here that they have in the GDPR, things like lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. This basically says, hey, personal data shall be processed lawfully, fairly, and in a transparent manner in relation to the data subject. Purpose limitation, this personal data shall be collected for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes and not further processed in a manner that's incompatible with those. Data minimization, so the data should be adequate, relevant, and limited to what's necessary in relation to the purposes that you're using that for. Accuracy, this should be accurate and where necessary kept up to date, and every reasonable step should be taken to ensure that that data is accurate. Storage limitation, so personal data, it's be kept in a form which permits identification of data subjects for no longer than is necessary. And again, we talk about for the purposes of which that data is processed. Integrity and confidentiality should be processed in a way that makes sure that we have security of that personal data. And of course, accountability. And accountability, the controller shall be responsible for and demonstrate compliance with the GDPR. So you see there's a lot of pieces in here on the core elements. But what we want to do next is take not just those core elements and start to link those to governing frameworks. Because like I mentioned before, it's very important for you, obviously, to focus on just compliance. But if you already in your organization are focusing on the governance of enterprise IT and the governance of information, you may be halfway there, okay? So let's talk a little bit about what we mean by governance of enterprise IT. So before we start, what's the real goal of the enterprise? We are here to create value for our stakeholders. And how do we do that? We do that through benefits realization, we do that through risk optimization, and we also do that through resource optimization. And so companies, like I said before, if you have a good governance structure, you may be in pretty good shape to get started down the road toward GDPR compliance. And if you don't have a governing framework in place, this may be a good indicator that, hey, put something in, something similar to COBIT, which is what I'm going to talk about here in just a little bit. And so these governance frameworks, okay, what are these things? They're good practices, and they're designed to be adaptable to a specific environment in which they're operating. Generally, these frameworks can withstand the test of time. They are acceptable regardless of the external environment and changes in technology. So these good governance frameworks, therefore, they're providing a common language, and they provide a sharp focus to help us meet compliance, regulatory requirements by having these repeatable methods, and of course, by creating value for the enterprise, okay? So a lot of countless frameworks exist out there in the market. You can just suffer, like Ron said, from framework overload, and I've been in many organizations that have this very thing. We have multiple frameworks, standards, bodies of knowledge, best practices, and they all have a fit in the organization. I'll talk about this in my tips in a little bit. But one of the things that I've found is when you're looking at compliance, regardless, it's good to have that core overarching framework that helps you identify those key things that, of course, create value for the enterprise. So I love this as my kickoff to COBIT. And I will tell you that in my search in many organizations, we're always trying to find that middleware framework that helps us translate through many different functions of the organization. And I know this is, I say this kind of tongue-in-cheek, but I will say this, is there is not one framework that will help you in governance of enterprise IT. There is not one framework that will help you be compliant with, or completely help you be compliant with, say, GDPR. But COBIT, I have found, and many in the industry have found, that it's a nice, solid governing framework that focuses on information. So let's talk just a little bit about COBIT. Again, you're not going to be a COBIT expert coming out of this, but it's important for you to know that today we simply call it COBIT, but its origins really based on confidentiality, integrity, availability, and assurance of one very important thing, and that's information. And it's very important for you to note that the I in COBIT stood for information, not IT, information technologies. It was information-related technologies, which makes this a very solid fit to looking at things like data and information with regards to privacy. So the latest version, COBIT 5, I consider, and many do in the industry, to be the only what we consider a business framework that focuses on governance and management of enterprise IT and the information. So it is principles-based. It's a holistic model, well-suited as a tool to assist in the adoption of good practices, especially when we're talking about an overarching framework towards, say, GDPR compliance. Okay, so one of the cool things about COBIT is that it's what we call principles-based. So if you have any understanding of this, so almost like GDPR, it's a principle-based compliance concern. Now we've got a framework that's also principles-based. So what we've got here is the first one, which is very important. It's called meeting stakeholder needs. What are we talking about here? We have a lot of different stakeholders in your organization, and what we have is something called a goals cascade. If you haven't looked at this thing, this is one of the best kept secrets in our industry. It is a guide that helps you walk through your stakeholder drivers, through your enterprise needs, all the way down into processes and practices within the COBIT framework, as well as all these other things we call enablers. And we're going to talk about what these enablers are here in just a minute. COBIT covers the enterprise end-to-end, all functions, all processes in the enterprise. Now, I get people say, well, you say it covers the enterprise end-to-end, everything. Where are the business processes like, say, process accounts payable? Well, COBIT manages the processes in enterprise IT that processes, stores, and transacts information for all of those business processes. So that's very key. The third one, we've already hit this a little bit, applying a single integrated framework. COBIT doesn't say it's the only show in town. COBIT actually links back to many other industry standards and frameworks, ISO standards, and so on, that links back so that you have a two-direction link between an industry framework that you may be using today and a good governing and control framework from a COBIT perspective. My personal favorite, enabling a holistic approach. We'll cover this again in the next slide, but this offers what we call a set of enablers, or I consider these ingredients to the success of your governance program. And then, of course, separating governance from management. Wherever you are in an organization, there will always be a governing body of some type above you, or governance processes, because you can't govern yourselves. And so in many organizations, and one that I was a part of not too long back, I was told specifically by my board, IT, govern yourselves. Well, if I'm asked to govern myself, what I'm being asked to do is make up my own rules, determine which of those rules I want to follow, and determine the consequences on those rules I choose not to follow. So we have to have a governing entity in an organization at different levels that help build the policy and direction for those units and functions that operate under the jurisdiction of that governing body. So those are what we call the COBIT principles. Now, I told you we have these things called enablers under the holistic approach, and here's what the enablers are. If you've never seen these before, it can be a little bit overwhelming, but just consider these ingredients to your program. When you're looking at GDPR, every one of these enablers, it has an effect on your compliance and your deployment of good practices to be able to support the GDPR. You see right there in the middle, we have principles, policies, and frameworks, right? This is the vehicle that translates desired behaviors into practical guidance. And we also have to have frameworks that allow us to link these policies to each other. We have processes. We'll dig more into processes here in a little bit, but what is a process? Organized set of practices and activities to achieve objectives and has a set of outputs. The COBIT framework has 37 of these processes across 5 domains, a governing domain and management domains. We're going to walk into that just a little bit because I'm going to link some of this GDPR to COBIT processes for you here in just a little bit. Organizational structures. This one it was one of the hardest ones for me to get down in my organization because it's easy to identify, but it's one of the hardest to actually document. This isn't just org charts, folks. This is actually looking at practices such as what are our decision-making entities? How can they make decisions? What decisions they can make? What can they delegate? And what's the span of control? This is a really, really big thing in GDPR because now we have some specific roles with decisions that have to be made within our compliance efforts. Clearly, culture, ethics, behavior is a very big enabler, so it is underestimated, I feel, as a success factor for good governance and management activities. So this is basically referring to that set of individual and collective behaviors in an enterprise that support the goal of providing value. So good practices here: communication, awareness of desired behaviors, incentives, rules and norms, and those types of things. The biggie is information. It's probably the lifeblood of not only COBIT, but the GDPR as well. Then information is pervasive in any organization, includes all information produced and used by the enterprise, and in this case, PII. And then we have services, infrastructure, application. This is the technologies and the services that support the organization. Good practices here, obviously, when we're looking at infrastructure reuse, those types of things. You can leverage a lot around the services side through frameworks like the ITIL framework and those types of things. And then finally, people, skills, and competencies. People are required for successful completion of these activities and making those decisions we talked about, but we have to define the right roles and they have to have the right competencies. And defining roles is a key point in the GDPR. So I told you a little bit about processes. Don't let this slide overwhelm you. This is basically to give you an appreciation for the breadth that the processes cover within the COBIT 5 framework. So the applicability of GDPR here is significant. For every process that you're looking at in this in the process reference model, COBIT identifies several areas. It talks about IT-related goals that are associated to it, metrics, process goals. It has what we call governance practices or management practices. We used to call those control objectives in previous versions. So that practice is the guidance necessary to achieve a process goal. Each one of these practices has a full set of activities. It has RACI charts, which are responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed, has inputs and outputs, and it gives us related guidance. For every process, it says, hey, there are other industry frameworks and standards that you can refer to for more detailed information. So if you take a look at all these processes, I'm going to be referring to a couple of these here in just a little bit, but the key thing for you to know is this fully recognized the governance and management of enterprise IT, and I'm here to tell you that if you really understand these processes and you look at the practices and the activities of these processes, you will find that there is a very solid link to the requirements you have in the GDPR, but you have to dig into the processes and really look at them. So like I said, there's 37 of them out there and you can see the breadth. You see a lot of them that are recognizable from other frameworks, right? So things like TOGAF, things like ITIL, ISO standards, all link back to many of these things. So you notice the column on the left, those are my governing processes, and the governance of enterprise IT and information, of course, the red cycle is more for the management side of the house. Okay, so now that I've completely pushed a bunch of information towards you about COBIT, let's start taking a look about how COBIT and the GDPR actually link together. So what I want to do is just pull out a couple of key areas that the GDPR espouses and make a link back to you so that it gives you at least a kind of initial mapping for you to use to be able to really link COBIT to these things. So the first one is GDPR says, hey, you define high-risk data and you have to do impact assessments. So a company must conduct data protection impact assessments, call them DPIAs, when you're using any technologies for data high risk. So it sounds kind of like a risk assessment, doesn't it? So those assessments must also also describe how a company is addressing those risks through the systematic and the processing, the extensive processing of monitoring. This sounds, like I said, like a risk assessment. So when I took a real deep look into the processes and practices within COBIT, what I found was many practices I have in place, and you might as well, also link back to this requirement of defining that data and the impact assessments. A couple of them of note. If you look at EDM 04, it says ensure risk optimization. You might remember that showed up in the governing domain. Risk optimization is looking at the overall risk tolerance levels of the enterprise and the guidance around being able to make risk decisions. Then one of the other ones here is APO 12, which is managed risk. This is at the management level. This is the process that a lot of people look at when they determine their risk assessment process, determining their risk profiles. And one of the important things here is looking at what the scenarios are. And if you look at scenarios, and you can now link how a risk scenario associated with GDPR, how it affects your business operations, your business goals, and your strategies, you have just done an assessment that says here is the key data that we now have to protect and the level at which we protect those, which now goes to a couple of other key processes: managed security services, and of course, business process controls, because the business, the owners of the data, IT doesn't own this data. They help us determine what the applicable controls are for being able to define high-risk data and do those impact assessments. So this is just a very short list of, you could go through almost any COBIT process and say, yeah, there's a link. But I think it's important to point these out for you because it's a good starting point from a mapping standpoint for each one of you. The next piece that we have here is called protection, processing, and storage of personal data. So for each individual, all personal data must be processed with transparency and only for the purpose specified for that individual. Now, companies must provide what we call reasonable level of data protection and privacy. So it must be processed securely to protect against unauthorized access, loss, or damage. This must be done using appropriate technical or even organizational measures and controls. But GDPR doesn't define what it means. It says you can presume that the data is not protected. Okay, so your company is clearly in breach of compliance if you are not doing these things. So it's very tricky. So that's why having this good framework in place helps drive a lot of the compliance efforts. So look at the following COBIT processes that might be able to help you out here. Of course, stakeholder transparency. This is openness and transparency in reporting and understanding. Enterprise architecture. This is a huge one. This was pretty new to COBIT 5 and really has a lot of core elements that focus on some very popular practices and frameworks around enterprise architecture. Of course, one of our big risks in a lot of organizations is third parties and suppliers that might be handling or processing data on our behalf. That's APO 10. And of course, BAI 2, and I wanted to put this in here because it's important. This is requirements definition. So what we're assuming here is when you deploy new services, when you are doing transactions for services that have PII, one of the things you might want to do when you're looking at new types of services is looking at this process to identify during the requirements phase what the protection requirements are, so that you don't have to do what we're doing now, is looking back and trying to figure it out after we've already deployed those services or that infrastructure. Of course, availability and capacity, very big from an infrastructure standpoint. Availability says, is this data available when it needs to be based on, say, service level agreements? But we can also link that into our security, saying who should have availability to this, and it helps drive the access arrangements. And of course, capacity. Do we have enough infrastructure to support the performance needs? And then of course, managed knowledge. If you have a core knowledge repository or several repositories that store data and knowledge, this will clearly be in scope of where you might have PII in your organization. Many more, of course, out there, but those are some of the key processes that I found that have a direct link back on the protection, processing, and the storage of that data. Let's move on to the next one, which is consent, portability, right to access, and I have the right to be forgotten. So Individuals must provide consent regarding the data being stored regarding them, as well as have the right to know upon request what personal data a company is using and how it's being used. So as an EU citizen, an EU citizen, you may transfer your personal data from one company to another in a machine-readable format upon request. So companies will stop processing and or delete personal data upon the request of an EU citizen. Wow, this is big. So it goes one step further and allows the right to be forgotten and having your personal data deleted upon request. Some of the key COBIT processes that I found out there, of course, ensure stakeholder transparency. We see a couple of these that are a little bit redundant. Manage GEiT framework, and of course, manage relationships, service agreements, and like we said before, suppliers and manage knowledge. So each one of those, remember, every process has a full complement of what we call practices and activities that allow us to further break that process down and control that process. So another big piece of the GDPR is the appointment of data protection officers. Now, one of the nice things that we do in COBIT is for every one of the processes is, like I mentioned before, there's a ratio chart. So it identifies some core roles in the organization and whether or not they have responsibility, accountability, and so on. So the appointment of data protection officers, some companies must appoint these officers, or we call them a DPO. And this role oversees the company's data security strategy and overall GDPR compliance. So who's required? Who has to do this? Well, companies that process or store what's considered large amounts of EU citizen data, process or store special personal data, regularly monitor data subjects, or our public authorities are now under this jurisdiction and must appoint a protection officer. So a couple of the key COBIT processes here that help, of course, making sure from a governing perspective, we have a governance framework and we have the setting and maintenance across the organization of that framework. This is where I truly believe that using the COBIT framework is helpful for us. Of course, managing human resources, the skills and the competencies, and ensuring that we have the right roles in place, and of course, managing security. Now, there is one of the enablers that we talked about a little bit earlier, and that's people, skills, and competencies, which also has a very big role within this, because people, skills, and competencies, do we have the right roles, the right competencies, certifications, and those types of things, as well as culture, ethics, and behavior has a big play in this piece. So there's a good starting list for you. Again, look at the practices on those things, and it might help you figure these pieces out. If you haven't seen this yet, if you haven't kind of figured this out, as we're going through each one of these areas of the GDPR, we're hitting a lot of COBIT processes. And I will tell you that by the time we're done, every single COBIT process will have been a part of GDPR compliance, which is why I'm really happy that this framework allows that end-to-end look for us. Now, reporting data breaches is another big concern. So companies, or more specifically data controllers, they're required to notify data protection authorities within 72 hours. So these data processors would typically discover a breach and will be responsible for notifying the controller. The good news here is that many organizations already have these procedures in place for notification, but very few actually conduct tests to ensure that the standards are met. So a couple of COBIT processes that you might see out here: manage operations, and this would be looking at how we are monitoring events and monitoring changes of state. Of course, service requests and incidents, more specifically the incident management process. If you're a company that's using, say, the IDLE framework, most likely you already have an incident management process in place. But what COBIT helps you do is look at what those controlled practices, or excuse me, what those management practices are to ensure that you have control of the process. Now, you might say, well, service requests and incidents, that's classified as one process here. Technically speaking, we control them using the same set of practices, but a lot of times they're different flows altogether. So looking at how you handle those incidents is a big deal, because if you don't have this right, you now are subject to big fines. So manage problems, obviously a very key one here, because in managed problems, what we're looking at is we're looking at trending of these incidents to help us determine where we do models around, say, root cause analysis to prevent future incidents from happening or reduce the number of incidents that are currently taking place. When an incident becomes a major event, we now might have a continuity issue on our hands in which there are different models in place to be able to support those. I kind of consider continuity management an extension of a lot of different processes: risk, security, availability, and incident management. So a lot of processes really get bundled into that one. And then, of course, no surprise, security services and business process controls. How sensitive is that data, and what are the control requirements for that specific data? Okay, so ensuring proper compliance, another big piece here. So in order to ensure proper compliance to this legislation, organizations need to ensure they constantly monitor, evaluate, and assess their controls to support your initiative. And you can do that at optimal cost and by continually investigating improvement in your technologies and your ideas. So organizations must provide an assurance that they are in compliance with those requirements. Some of the processes that can help you here: you see the first three, MEA 1, 2, and 3. Those are monitor and evaluate and assess processes that help you look at performance versus conformance. You know, in an organization, you cannot be fully 100% conformant to everything, because you have to have this fine balance between performance and conformance. So what is the right mix? That's the process that helps you look at that. Look at, obviously, the system of internal control, which is key for us for our internal controls that we have in place when we're looking at assurance and audit. And of course, MEA 3, the biggie here, external requirements. Okay, some others that make a lot of sense: managing innovation. What are the ideas we're having to improve our compliance? Portfolio, how are we looking at all of the resources that we are using, and how are we assigning priorities and budgets towards programs and projects, and of course, our budgets and costs. And as mentioned before, there are several other processes out there that support it, but these are the key ones that I've been able to find that I think are important for you from a COBIT perspective. So we've pretty much at this point covered all of the key points of GDPR and some processes that I think are very important for you to consider. Now, don't forget those enablers that I talked about too, because a process is just one of 7 enablers. So when I look at a process, now we have other enablers that might be affected as well. So that's that holistic look that I think is important for you to be able to consider in this effort. Okay, so let's go in to talk about some tips. I've assembled what I call my top 10 tips to adoption, and these, you know, they're specifically designed for us to look at how you can leverage COBIT to help and aid in your compliance with the GDPR. But if you think about it, a lot of these tips, they're applicable in almost any case when you're looking at compliance to external requirements. And the first one here should not surprise you at all, and it's develop a sense of urgency. So gaining executive level support and getting that sense of urgency is absolutely key. This will drive attitudes and expectations in the enterprise required to adopt good governance practices to support your GDPR compliance. So one of the things that I think is important here is to look at is when you're looking at sense of urgency is try to focus at first on what we call quick wins. I have been a victim of an organization where I've been driving this effort, and we're trying to get some big stuff in right up front so that we can prove that the compliance and the control framework we have in place works. And what we found was we bit off more than we could chew. So the idea here is when you're looking at your potential, when your sense of urgency and your potential projects to kick off to support this, look at those areas that give you the highest business benefit, and at first that might not be as difficult for your organization to adopt. And therefore those quick wins can raise some eyebrows and really develop a sense of support for your business case along those lines. So one of the things that also can really develop a sense of urgency is to actually link the requirements you have for GDPR to the risks, to the enterprise goals. Now, as an executive, if I can now see that there is a risk scenario that is such a highly likelihood, has high degree of impact on business goals, that's going to develop a sense of urgency, and therefore it's going to force me as an executive now to support and develop that sense of urgency. So a hint for you guys, there's a guide called the COBIT 5 Implementation Guide. So it gives some great tips and techniques on what we call recognizing the need to act and gaining executive level support. It focuses on things like trigger events, pain points, and external factors that might be a part of that. So it's a really nice guide for you from the COBIT product family that might be able to help you out there, okay? All right, so tip number 2, think of this as an opportunity. And so a lot of people, when you look at these types, of things, people start saying, "Oh my gosh, this is such a burden for us." But it's an opportunity for you. So gaining and maintaining compliance, it seems burdensome at times, but it's clearly the right approach is to think of this as an opportunity, because remember that the reason you exist as an enterprise is to create value for your stakeholders. And although this feels like a pain point, we're creating value for our stakeholders through this legislation. So some of the hints on this stuff is what I consider using this COBIT goals cascade. So when we talk about this is if you're looking at this as an opportunity, now you've set the GDPR requirements into how it affects your enterprise goals and therefore how it affects your IT related goals. This goals cascade is what I consider, I mentioned before, one of the best kept secrets, because it can help you identify based on certain external events or stakeholder drivers, if you will. It can help you point to specific enabler goals. And what are those enablers? One of them that we've talked about up to this point are called processes. And we've already linked some of these back to the processes for you. But some other areas for opportunity is it can now help you look at how you might be managing your policies, your organizational structures or your decision boundaries, culture, information, services, and of course your people, your skills, and your competencies. So this is a really nice tip to kind of think about that. If you're looking for the goals cascade, it is in the COBIT framework as well. And I would highly suggest you take a look at that, because it really gives you a well-rounded look at how you might be able to create value for the enterprise by looking at GDPR as an opportunity, okay? Okay, so the next tip, and I've mentioned this a little bit earlier, is the whole framework overload piece. And I will tell you that, in an organization that I was a part of, especially when we were looking at things like in the U.S. Sarbanes-Oxley and to a smaller degree for me, HIPAA. And one of the things that we were trying to find was the silver bullet, and I mentioned this earlier, but get yourself a good inventory of the frameworks that you have. Because like I mentioned before, COBIT doesn't answer every question for you, but it can point you to the right practice or framework that might be able to be applicable for you. So here's an example of how you might be able to do that. And again, this is not a complete list, it's just an example only. So in your inventory, what are you using for things like governance, architecture, service management, project, program, risk, security, quality, and even in your life cycles? And look at what the example standards and good practices or best practices are in your organization, and you will quickly become overwhelmed. But remember, each one of them has a place for you. So for example, you see there's a lot in here that has COBIT for us. So we looked at COBIT everywhere from risk management, security management, and those types of things. So look at your inventory, because again, COBIT can link back to this for you. So this GDPR, this regulatory concern, it can be satisfied by adopting not just one, but many frameworks into your ecosystem of frameworks that you have out there, okay? Now, I'm always very careful when I talk about adoption of frameworks as opposed to implementation of frameworks. I would tell you that in my experience, you generally don't implement. Anyway, this is my experience, because when somebody says we implement a framework, as an executive, I'm going to ask you, well, I want the completion date for your implementation. And so when you adopt frameworks, you've never done adopting. It is a reference for you. It's a good practice or a standard. Now, unless you're going down the path of an ISO IEC certification, that's a different story altogether. And you do notice in here there are a lot of ISO standards that we reference. I'm not stating that you have to go be ISO compliant, but they are great references for you, even if you're not going down the path of being compliant. Another one of the frameworks that we've seen that we've used a lot, especially around the security. When I say ISO 27000 series on security, we also looked at the NIST, not only the NIST 8 special publication series, but we also leveraged the NIST cybersecurity framework, which was a very nice addition into this family of practices that we used. All right, so let's move on to the next tip. All right, so like we mentioned before, this may be a little redundant, but you can tell that this really is very important for you. So anyway, if you use COBIT to be a framework to help manage these frameworks, like I mentioned before, don't just stop with one. So it's an extension of this previous tip we talked about, but since I consider this the only framework for the governance and management of enterprise IT and the information that I process, it's the game in town. So use this as the central framework to help determine other components out there that you might want to take a look at. And so you notice that we looked at, and a lot of folks make this link from their enterprise governance, which links your performance and your conformance goals. And one of our conformance goals is, of course, GDPR. How do we link that to the existing frameworks we use today? That is through COBIT. So the process reference model in COBIT points you to these common industry frameworks for every one of those 37 processes. And it says, hey, COBIT doesn't have it all for you. So go to these other frameworks for more detailed guidance that might assist you. Okay, next tip, what we got is get these roles. Start looking at the roles now, because you notice one of the things that we talked about earlier was the appointment of data protection officer and the applicable roles that come along with that. So even if you don't think you're affected by GDPR, there's still good roles to identify and appoint in an organization. So you may find that a lot of the roles that are required, you may already have them fulfilled now, just maybe under different names. So one of the things that hints here is, in the COBIT processes, every one of the processes down to the practice level, it identifies an associated set of roles as well as their applicability in the RACI chart for you. So a lot of this has already been done. This doesn't mean, this is not standard, right? This is not legislation you're looking at. It's just an idea that you can obviously modify your RACI charts, add roles, change the accountabilities as you see fit for your organization. Okay, so let's move on to tip number 6. It's coming, there we go. One of the things we talked about earlier was that thing called a risk assessment. Now what you're looking at here is not the template for you to use that's applicable just for GDPR. It's just an example of how you might want to look at looking at enterprise risk. So one of the things I want to be very clear here on is when you're looking at enterprise risk, you're looking at scenarios. And as your executive, you know, one of the things I do want to know, I want to know what our high value assets are, the cost of breach, those types of things. But it's very important for you to think about what are those possible risks, those scenarios. A risk is an event that, if it becomes real, has a material effect on the enterprise being able to create value. And in my case, being able to basically achieve my business goals. So one of the things you can look at are a set of scenarios, and again, this is not a complete list, it's just a truncated list of some thoughts. But you take those risk scenarios, and now you can break those down into the type, and you can actually rank those scenarios based on severity. And again, this is just a simple 1, 2, 3, but severity means how much effect does this risk scenario have on me meeting one of my business goals? My business goal might be GDPR compliance. Well, there might be some scenarios that really have a major effect on that. So you just notice there's just more of a, you know, the little pie charts that show you the connection between that risk becoming real and its effect on the business goal. So that would be how you look at severity. You then look at likelihood. Now, likelihood, there are a lot of different ways which you can look at this, from a statistical format, or even more of a logical approach, but a more of a discussion approach on this. But at least understanding the likelihood, that can now give you your heat map, if you will, to look at those risk scenarios that are the highest severity, highest likelihood, and therefore that helps you look at what we talked about earlier called performance and conformance. And now as an organization, we can look at those data elements and the scenarios that could affect each one of those data. So a little tip for you here, COBIT 5 for risk, by the way, gives you a great set of what we call generic risk scenarios. Doesn't mean you have to use them, you can modify them, as well as the ISO 31000 standard, some really good starting points for how you might want to conduct a risk assessment at the enterprise level. Our next tip is training and awareness. You know, a good practice that oftentimes people forget is how you educate your organization on what's about to happen or what is taking place. And not just what is taking place, but how are we going to manage this throughout the life cycle of GDPR. So launch a widespread program. So everyone in the organization has to be familiar with the requirements and know what their role is in that requirement. So obviously training, most likely one of the most important actions you can take to increase the likelihood of a successful program. So you can look at some things like how are we changing our processes and policies? How are we training and educating people? Because in some cases, this might be a major effect on how people do their work. So some courses out there, of course, things like COBIT Foundation. You can look at COBIT implementation. Other courses out there implementing the NIST cybersecurity framework. Of course, cybersecurity nexus training platform on the cybersecurity pieces of that, all appear to be very applicable from my perspective on some good training from an external perspective. Now, start doing this now, and you can actually create your own internal training programs, obviously around your own organizational structures and the culture of your organization. Okay, getting close, folks. So tip number 8. This is big because remember what the I stood for in COBIT. Stood for information. This is your focus. Whoops, I think I went too far for you. Hang on. All right, sorry about that. Clearly, I don't know how to work this thing very well. Let's go back. Okay, give me a second here. All right, one more. There we go. So I jumped ahead on you. Sorry about that. So this is a big one. We talked about incident management earlier. Remember, one of the big concerns we've got here is that we have to notify, right? So 72 hours from discovery on this stuff. So what is our incident response plan? Again, you may have some form of incident response plan in place, but there may be some of these requirements in the GDPR that you haven't really considered yet. So again, we talk about reporting within 72 hours of discovery. So how well your response teams react will directly affect the company's risk of fines for that breach. So what you might want to do is obviously look at leveraging existing models and link your monitoring platforms for more efficiency. That way, if you have a change of state or an event that's captured by a monitoring tool, you can either automatically heal that event through that tool, or you can have a quicker response to that, so therefore you can meet the requirements of GDPR. And rehearse. Desktop, tabletop exercises, actual incident response exercises. You may do this as a part of your general incident management processes, as well as, say, your continuity or disaster recovery types of things. But have those plans in place because it can really gain your efficiency. And so what you can do is look at your existing incident response plans, how you may have new roles and new timelines. You may have new priorities and categories as a part of this new process, but leverage best class frameworks like we mentioned earlier, like things like COBIT and things like ITIL to help you build your incident response models. Very important for you there. Okay, good. So now we're going to jump to tip number 9. This is the one I started on a few minutes ago. All right, this one is information. Like I said before, this is key because information is an asset. Information is a resource. And if you don't protect it, information is now a liability for you. So understanding attributes, understanding location of your data, and the life cycle can help enhance your ability to provide the protections that are required under the GDPR. And so, like I said, information has a life cycle, so it has different forms through this life cycle, and there may be different ways or different approaches to how we protect that PII throughout its life cycle. So one of the big hints here that I think are very important for you is use the COBIT 5 Enabling Information Guide here. If you haven't taken a look at this, some people look at it and say, oh boy, this is really, really in-depth. But this, again, this is part of the COBIT 5 product family. And remember, information was what we called an enabler. within the COBIT-5 holistic approach. So there's a complete guide that walks through not only the life cycle of information, but it talks about the attributes of information through its life cycle and helps assist you in really determining what types of practices you may want to have in place to basically store the information, to acquire the information, to process the information, to retire the information, all requirements under the GDPR. So if you haven't been able to see this yet, information is what your focus is in the enterprise when you're talking about compliance to the GDPR. All right, one more tip for you, and that last tip is continuous assessment and assurance. So this is nothing new either. So maintaining your compliance requires continuous monitoring and continuous improvement. So you have to be careful not to let your efforts fade away as you move on to the next thing. You'll be in for a very big surprise. And that's the whole idea of continual service or continual improvement models. Keep your momentum going. It creates a sustainable approach where continual improvement now occurs naturally in your organization as a rhythm. So these durations of these improvements should be based on obviously maturity and scope. But if you go through iterations like say a Deming's PDCA approach, ITIL, CSI, and with COBIT implementation approach, generally you don't do a cycle over 6 months. We preferred in our organization about 3 months for a continuous cycle, and that became part of normal operating procedures for us. So a hint here is some great models out there help you with continuous approaches. One is a COBIT-5 implementation model. We mentioned before, there's a complete guide on that. There's a lot of great tips and tricks in that for deploying a continuous improvement model towards adopting governance of enterprise IT. We have the continual service approach that's come out of the ITIL framework under the CSI stage of the life cycle. NIST, the NIST implementation model for implementation of the NIST cybersecurity framework also has a deployment life cycle. It is also based on the Deming's what we call the PDCA approach or the Plan, Do, Check, Act approach, okay? Also, there's a really, really neat set of guides out that they're the ISACA's audit and assurance programs. A couple of them out there for NIST as well as every single 37 process. There is an assurance guide for that helps you determine your auditing scope. And what's really nice about that is that it focuses on all of the enablers that are associated to that process. So again, a nice holistic approach to help you put that rhythm in place, because we don't want to go through process atrophy where we improve a process, forget about it, and it just falls over after time. Okay, great stuff. So I know I've loaded you down with a whole bunch of information, but let me just hit a quick summary for you guys just real quick, and I'll make sure that that we have time, hopefully, for a couple questions in here in just a second. All right, so one of the things that I think is important for us to remember here, there we go, is don't forget, we're in this to create value for our stakeholders and for our enterprise. And GDPR should be part of a larger initiative. Don't focus on this as one more thing you just have to do. Step up. Look at your governing model, and therefore it will create a much easier path for you to be able to associate with GDPR or any other compliance or regulatory concern that might come up in the future for you. A big one here is to be able to use COBIT as the integrator. And I know you've heard me say it before, it's your framework to manage frameworks, and I considered it middleware. So it helped me communicate between internal audit, between risk, between my compliance, and my legal and regulatory, and it gave us that common language that we can now use as a part of that. So before I finish up, I just wanted to also point out, like I said before, every part of this framework can be applicable when you're looking at GDPR compliance. The information that I've shared with you in this presentation, there will also be a white paper being published soon, and keep an eye out for that, because we take the same information that I just shared with you over this webinar, and I really give a little bit more detail and background between some of the relationships and connections and some other tips when it comes to adopting GDPR compliance using a governing framework model like ITIL. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, this has been a lot of information. I hope it's been helpful for you. But what I want to do next is let's go back. Hey, Ron, you mind helping out? And let's see if you have any questions maybe to hit.
No, Mark, thank you very much. And that is very, very practical advice on how to prepare for the GDPR. As Mark mentioned earlier in his presentation, GDPR becomes real, I think, in May, so it's not that far away. And it is no small matter to be prepared for the arrival of these regulations. We do have time for a couple of questions, though, so I will kind of dive right into those. So, Mark, here's the first one for you. My company only has offices in the U.S. Does the GDPR affect us in any way?
Yeah, so you hear a lot about this, and in fact, I've talked to many organizations just within the last couple of months say, "Oh, that's EU stuff." But if you're in the U.S. and you have PII on an EU citizen, you are under the jurisdiction of this legislation. And so that's the big thing we talked about, is getting a good inventory of the data that you have on citizens. Think about it. If I'm in an organization and I have PII on a citizens of EU, even though I do business just in North America, now I may have to be compliant to that. So the answer would be yes. That's where a lot of, I believe, North American companies have been a little bit kind of slow to adopt this. They haven't realized the magnitude and the reach of the regulation yet.
Thank you. Next one. You mentioned using process practices as the link between COBIT and GDPR. Where can I find those practices?
Okay, so I believe that when you're looking at processes, one of the key things is, how is that process broken down into things that I need to do to control this process? And that's what we call process practices. And so within the COBIT framework, out of all those 37 processes, kind of picture yourself double clicking on a process, and it takes you to a guide called the Enabling Process Guide. So within the COBIT framework, one of the publications is called an enabler guide called Enabling Processes. In that guide, for every one of the processes, you can look down and find for each one, it says, okay, here are the practices that you have to have in place. Now, we used to call those control objectives, but it's good now we call them practices, because it puts some management and leadership involved in actually controlling a process. So the COBIT 5 process reference model in the Enabling Process Guide will be where you find those practices, and each practice is then further broken down into more detail, and we call those activities. So that's where you find that information on practices.
All right, we've got time for a couple more real quick ones here, and let me just see if I can get this question up here. So it says, great webinar, clarify some of the questions I had. How many hours can it take to implement GDPR using COBIT 5? Because each COBIT 5 process is large to implement.
You said we're going to hit a couple of quick questions. So, and that is a common recurring question. So, especially when you're trying to look at how you're allocating your portfolio, how you're budgeting towards applying resources to this. I will tell you the first thing is this. Who knows, right? You could be compliant today, based if you have a mature governing framework. My suggestion is, and I'll kind of give you some more information in a second, my suggestion is look at your current posture for how you govern enterprise IT today with the current, whether there's a current framework, and do an assessment on what the gap is between where you currently state in relation to your meeting the GDPR regulation and where you need to be in order to be able to be compliant. So that gap will then give you basically a series of projects and and initiatives that help you do that, and then you can kind of estimate the time and duration it takes you. But I will say that you're never done adopting this stuff, and when like I said, I don't use the word implement because you are continuously doing this. So I would think it would take analysis of the gaps between where you currently are in your in meeting the regulation, where you need to be, and that will help you. So I'm always hesitant to give a time, and even if you said, hey, I'm not going to hold you to it, as soon as I give you, let's say I throw out 6 months, somebody's going to be etching that in a stone tablet and say that is now the standard. So I'm always very careful about it. But this is not weeks. This is months and years. Okay, and so and I think that's very important to point that out.
All right, great. Well, thanks. Well, unfortunately, we do not have time for more questions. We are now 1 minute past the hour. So I want to thank Mark, you for all of this great insight you shared with us. I appreciate you taking the time and putting in all the preparation to do this. I would like to thank our audience for taking time out of your day to listen to this. Hopefully, you have found this information to be of use and something you can apply in your own organizations. With that, I would like to wish everybody a good day, the remainder of your day, whether it is morning or afternoon where you're at, and hopefully we will see you on a future webinar. Thank you very much, and take care.